So welcome to part 3 of this 3-part series about the Rostermania tier list. Today we're going to do Pacific. Very quick reminder that the tier list is going to be based off what I think a realistic ideal for the teams is. Not necessarily how good they are at all, but just what was their ideal offseason and roster construction. And so let's kick it off then with Zeta Division, who have made some changes, and the spreadsheet is a little old now. Because this has been kind of confirmed that Ten and Crow are out. Crow is actually becoming an assistant coach. XQQ is also out and is becoming a content creator, meaning that I'm pretty sure that Junior is going to become their full-time head coach. Crow is an assistant coach, and then they're looking for 2 other players. And that is what it seems like Zeta Division are going to do, and I think a lot of people will be rejoiced to know that, because it felt like it was time for Zeta Division to finally make some changes. Don't know if this will be a full Japanese team still, or whether they're just gonna, keep that core and maybe go a bit international. We'll have to see exactly who they bring in, but the fact that they've made a change, I think most people will be pretty happy about. And so for that, I'm gonna put Zeta Division in the A tier. That might seem a bit weird because, we don't know who they're bringing in yet, but I think the fact that they've kept the 3 that I think most people thought they should have kept, and the fact that they are making changes, I think is definitely a step in the right direction, because Zeta have been a team that have refused to make changes for a very long time. Okay, moving on to DRX, and people will have different opinions on this one, of course, because DRX, it looks like, are just running it back exactly the same as it has been for a very long time now, and I know for a lot of people, they might feel like, that's not the way to go. For me, personally, I don't mind it. The reason that I don't mind it is because, one, you always have to ask the question, like, okay, if you do get rid of someone, who are you getting rid of, and who is going to replace them, right? Who is a suitable replacement for whoever, you get rid of, and you start thinking about some of those options, and you have to ask, would that actually be that much of an upgrade, right? And I think that's a fair question to ask. Obviously, I know some people have some problem with the head coaches and how exactly DRX play and stuff like that, and that's all absolutely fair, and I don't expect DRX to change. The thing is, DRX are still, a top 5-6 team in the world. They have been for a very long time, and for a lot of teams, they might view that as, okay, we're top 5-6 in the world. We consistently get deep in these international event tournaments. Maybe we just need some good luck and then we'll finally win it. Now, I would say that's maybe not going to be the case for DRX, but you could view it in that way. And so keeping the roster together in that sense maybe does make some sense. And so for that, I'm going to put DRX in the B tier because I just think, like, yeah, it's okay, right? I don't think it's a horrific decision to keep the roster and coaching staff together. I think it's fine, but I don't necessarily think it's their ideal either. Okay, our third team here is Talon Esports, who are off the rails, and you can see it here on the spreadsheet, looking for international roster. Will trial new and current players, as well as possibly Boy, who used to play for 100 Thieves, but is now their coach and looks like is somewhat in line to become the head coach, maybe, I guess. And you can see the players on the right there, the old roster, some of those players, like with the yellow question mark, like maybe they'll be back, maybe they won't, who knows. And obviously, who knows what the roster will end up looking like. It seems pretty late in the day, right, to still not have, like, anyone confirmed on your team. That seems maybe like a bit of a problem. But just the idea of completely scrapping it overall, obviously, Talon had a awful year last year in the Pacific League, and so I don't necessarily blame them for going this way. That could be seen as a decent decision, but obviously who knows what their roster will actually end up looking like. And so for that, I'm going to put Talon in the B tier, because blowing it up, like, maybe is the right choice, but at the same time, it's like, who knows exactly what their roster will end up like, and I'm a bit concerned for them that, it's in October now, right, and we don't have a single player who is confirmed for the team. Speaking of, let's come to our next team, Detonation Focus Me, who it has been confirmed since this spreadsheet that, some players like Denfree are going to leave, and maybe they're going to keep some of the players from the old roster, and to me, that's just not a good idea, right? If I was Detonation, I'd just be saying completely blow this thing up, right? They didn't win a single game last year, like, straight away, just everyone gone. Right, just start fresh. Even if you think some of those players are good and still deserve tier 1 chances, whatever, right, that might be fair, but I would just say let's completely start from scratch, kind of do what Talon are doing, where, yeah, maybe we trial some of our players as we're looking to form a new roster. Again, it's a bit concerning that, like, we haven't heard of anyone being, like, confirmed to be on this roster just yet, and again, it is getting a bit late in the day, so that worries me as well, but also, I just don't like the fact of potentially keeping really really anyone from the old roster. And, maybe we'll bring in Lakia, who's, yeah, like a decent player if that does happen. But, I need to see something. I need to see someone confirmed on this roster before I can, give Detonation any benefit of the doubt. And so I'm going to put Detonation in the C tier. As I said, I feel like we should have just completely blown it up and just made that very, very clear that that's what was going to happen. And so I'm not too excited for how this roster might end up looking. Okay, moving on to Team Secret here, and you can see it looks like they've got rid of their coach, Warbirds, and they also got rid of Dubstep, and it looks like they were having some trials for that last kind of spot, and it looks like they've settled on Jinsanity, according to the spreadsheet here somewhat. And Jinsanity, he was actually playing in NA and doing, a decent job there, and, maybe looks like a decent player, but again, is that going to necessarily be definitely better than Dubstep? I don't know. And then obviously we have to see exactly what the head coach is doing, keeping this roster together. They were okay last year, right? That's what Team Secret were. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking we'll probably be in that okay tier most likely again. And so for Team Secret, I'm also going to put them in the B tier. Like, making some changes might help a bit, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be enough to, propel them to being, at the top Pacific necessarily. Okay, global esports. Now, this one is a very interesting one, of course, because they pretty much blew it up. They have kept Lightning Fast and their coaching staff here, but obviously they bring in Benkai, Blaze King, Russ, Polvi. Benkai isn't even IGLing. That's going to go to Russ, apparently. And in terms of, the signings themselves, like, yeah, it's all fine. For me, I have kind of a philosophical problem with the way that Global have approached this, right? In terms of if I was like a GM of a team and how I would build a roster, outside of like, force changes where a player retires or something like that, right? I think Fnatic should be the kind of like goal for everyone, right? They're the team that's had the most success last year, and I think the way they built their roster makes the most sense, right? Where if you look at Fnatic, there was just different iterations where, hey, we start with Boaster, let's keep Boaster, then we bring in Durka, we'll keep Boaster and Durka from that iteration, and then as we go forward, right, it's like, okay, we found Althea, yeah, let's keep those three together, make more changes, right? And then eventually you end up with just a roster of insanely good players. Now for Global, my thing there is, well, you had what I consider an insanely good player on your team last year in Munyet, right? I think Munyet is just a very, very good player. And so for me, if I'm building this global esports roster, I'm thinking, well, if we want to get rid of everyone else, absolutely fine. But just keep the player who is insanely good on your team, right? And just go from there. So that I think is already like a big mistake in my personal opinion, because it just makes me think like, okay, what happens this year if, Benkai is really good, but the rest aren't, right? Or Blaze King really pops off, but, no, everyone else struggles. Or whoever it is, right? Are they just going to get shipped out again? Maybe we get a nice buyout and yay, we have that. Like that's, I think, potentially going to be a problem for them. And it's not. And obviously this could go decently well. It could go horrifically wrong, right? I think there's a massive range of outcomes because you're starting from complete scratch pretty much here for Global. But for me personally, I think they had to keep Munyet for me to feel good about the direction of this team because I know that Munyet is a very good player. And so for that, I'm going to actually put Global in the C tier. Again, it has nothing really to do with the players that they brought in, who I all think, is a bit of a mismatch and a bit of a hodgepodge of different people from different places and whatever, which I have my doubts about whether that will work or not. But it's less to do with those actual players, the more it is, just to get rid of Munyet, and I just don't think that that's the best way that they could have built their team this season, because I think keeping Munyet would have been like priority number one for me if I was the global esports manager. And the next thing can be said for our next team as well, pretty much in Gen G, because they have kept Meteor, which I think big thumbs up for that one, right? And then some of the players that they've brought in, right, you can see that Texture is guaranteed to be on the roster as well. You've got Jojo from the old Northeption roster, who I think was their IGL, so I'd imagine would IGL this team, but then Munchkin was also IGLing at one point for T1, so who knows? You bring in Intro as well, like, all, like, I would say, like, okay level players, right? Not maybe, like, top tier players, but, like, all decent players, let's say. But to me, again, the big thing is you let go of King, and I just don't understand that move whatsoever, because, again, I think King is a really, really good player, and so you should want, if it was me, again, we would be keeping Meteor and King, and we would, be going from there if I was Gen G. We also don't know who their coaching staff is going to be, and to me, this roster just, again, is it going to be better than the one that you had last year? Probably not, and you didn't do amazingly last year. You started off well, but, it quickly fell apart, so there's question marks there as well. And so for Gen G, kind of similar to Global, where I'm going to have to put them in the C tier just because keep good players, right? If you have a good player, keep a good player. That is what I would say, and they seemingly did not do that. Okay, Paper Rex, obviously Jing had to go and do military service. They keep everyone together, and they bring in Monyet, who I obviously said before, I think is a really good player, and I think is probably the best thing they could have got, to be honest. You have to remember they can't bring in an import because something is already counted as their import. So it had to be from Pacific, and I think Monyet looked really good last year, and so I think that this is probably the best they could have done. And so considering that, of course, that means that I have to put Paper X in S tier, because I think that realistically, Monyet was probably the best replacement they could have got for Jing, and keeping everyone else together obviously makes sense. So yeah, Paper X have to go in the S tier. Okay, moving on to Bleed, and this one is obviously very interesting. They were forced to make a couple changes. They brought in Egoist, who was actually kind of rumored to be the Jing replacement for Paper Rex, so you'd assume that Egoist must be a half-decent player if he's rumored to be going to Paper Rex. And obviously they brought in Ye, and Ye is obviously the one where people are going to have wildly different opinions in terms of, you know, how this might go. Obviously, it's a very hype signing for Bleed, and how Ye will do. You know, there's some people who think that Ye will, you know, go and dominate the Pacific League. There's some people who think that Ye is completely washed and, you know, just is not even a good player, right? I am much more in the kind of wait and see category with this, because I still think that Ye is a good player, but there are a lot of external factors as well, right? Like he's living in a completely different country, you know, playing on a team who does speak English, but, you know, just everything culture-wise is going to, of course, be very, very different for Ye and Bleed as a whole here. So yeah, I'm still very much in the kind of wait and see, but I'm just excited to see it, and it's a very hype signing at the very least. And in terms of where I'm going to put Bleed on this tier list, I'm going to put them in the A tier. Now, I know some of you will be saying put them in S tier, and some of you are probably saying put them in D tier, because you just think that Ye's not going to do well. I think that Ye probably will do pretty well, and it's hype at the very least, which is just good for the league. But I'm not going to put them in S tier, because for me, if Bleed could afford anyone, right, if, you know, apparently money is no issue for Bleed, then for me, probably their best, their most ideal signing would have been Aspas. Right, if you're bringing in an import player, because Aspas, of course, you know, was playing still at the very highest level, you know, last year, and I feel like, you know, if we are going more towards the kind of raise meta, we know Aspas's raise is good, whereas, you know, Ye's raise is a bit more of an unknown in general. So I think that Aspas would have been the absolute ideal for Bleed, but Ye is still a very hype signing and still could work out very well for them. Obviously, we'll just have to see how it goes. Okay, now moving on to T1, who I have to give some credit to, because it would have been very easy for T1 to say, hey, we made it to Tokyo, we made it to Champs, successful season, run it back, right? That would have been very easy for them to do, but they haven't done that. They've made changes, significant changes, getting rid of 3 players from their roster, which I actually think is a good move, because I think last year in Pacific, it was very clearly a top 2, and then, you know, the rest, basically, and T1 just so happened to be the top of the rest, right? But there was still a massive gap to DRX and Paper X in my mind, and so by making these changes, they're basically saying, hey, we want to close the gap. And the way that they've built this roster as well, keeping Sire player, keeping Zeta, it's, as I said, it's like that Fnatic style where, you know, you have a roster and you just keep what you think are the best parts of that roster and then move on from the rest, right? And they bring in King, who I've already said I think is a terrific player, and, you know, that core 3 of Sire, Zeta, King, I think it's a very, very strong core to have. Now, the other players they're bringing in, Itsu and Exaccurate, who is Forsaken's brother, are obviously a little more unknown at the very top level. It could go very well, it might not go as well. But again, I think for T1 here, I'm looking at Sire, Zeta, King, and I think you've got 3 players who are a very strong core, and whether Itsu or Exaccurate work or don't, right, then you can do the Fnatic thing again, like midway through this year or next year if you want, where you flush them out and you bring in other players until you find, you know, your Leo and Chronicle, and all of a sudden you're a super team, right? So I like the direction that T1 have gone, and yeah, I think this was a pretty good general direction for them to go. And so for that, I'm going to put them at the top of A tier. I'm not going to quite put them in S tier, because I still think there is some unknowns with those other players they are bringing in. But I think this is a very, very strong step for T1, and I really like the direction that they are heading. And then RRQ, who are kind of doing a similar thing as well, where, you know, they've kept the core of the team that they think is, you know, good enough with Flips, Zafiro, and Lemimore. Keep Ewok as the head coach as well. And then they bring in some other players to potentially boost it with Estrella and Jemkin. And, you know, Jemkin is obviously known for, you know, not getting a single kill on a game of Bind whilst playing Reyna, which is particularly rough. And that is not a great thing to be known for. But in general, Jemkin was a very good player. you know, throughout last year in the Japanese scene. And Estrella as well was part of the Korean team who made it to Ascension and looked pretty good in those games also. So I like the signings they've made. I think they're two players who, you know, yeah, you're signing players from the top of tier 2, right? Those are the kind of players that you want to be bringing into tier 1. So it makes sense, and keeping the core together, I kind of like it as well. So I kind of like the direction that RRQ are heading as well. And so for RRQ, I'm also going to be putting them into the A tier because, again, I think they've done a decent job and are heading in that right direction. So there is my Pacific tier list. And so that is the end of this series. Although, as I said at the very beginning of the series, it may be like a month's time or whatever, right, when pretty much everyone's roster should be finalized. We should have a pretty good idea of exactly of the rosters at that point. At that point, I'll probably do this process again where, you know, we can fully like dive in and go like, oh, you know, this player is good, that player isn't, well, that player is trash. And, you know, just rank these teams in terms of where I think, you know, they were and how they've done in the offseason thus far. But thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this series in general.